Hello everybody and welcome back to another video. Today I'm watching We Have to Talk About Weed by Kurzgesagt. Before we start, I should probably also clarify that I'm against weed, so just keep that in mind. Link to the original video will be down in the description below.
Cannabis has been vilified to a ridiculous degree for the last century, but it's now finally being decriminalized in more and more places around the world. It's just recently been legalized in Germany, and for very good reasons. Compared to legal drugs like alcohol, which will cause 1 in 20 deaths just this year, cannabis is pretty mild. So, to justify harsh prosecution and punishment, its negative effects have been wildly overstated. Naturally, there was a lot of pushback, and here's something went wrong. If you followed the discourse over the last few years, you might have got the impression that weed has almost only upsides and few, if any, negative side effects. We ourselves contributed to that narrative. What made this worse is that criminalization made it very hard for scientists to study cannabis, especially its long-term effects. It
definitely has negative
legal
effects.
Hurdles and studies
There's no way it's
often
just
rely on
positive.
small sample sizes. In the last few years, this finally started to change, so it's time to bring new evidence to the discussion. And, well, it's not pretty. While weed is still much less harmful than alcohol, it does have a dark side. It is more addictive than we thought and can have significant negative effects if you use it long term.
That wasn't known before? Weed can be addictive and can have really bad effects on your body. Crazy. Seems like common sense to me.
Seems that... what are you doing? Before you tell us how dumb we are, please watch the video. To be crystal clear, we think prohibition doesn't work and cannabis should be legal, but this also means that we need to treat it as what it is, a drug, with unique upsides and downsides. So let's take an honest look at some of the latest research together. Weed is getting stronger and stronger. Cannabis's magic juice is tetrahydrocannabinol, THC. It docks on your cannabinoid receptors, which affects various brain functions. THC activates some regions and calms down others, creating a fun cocktail of sensations. The more THC, the more intense the high. And people seem to be into higher highs, or at least this is what the market is providing. In the US, Canada, and in Europe, the concentration of THC in legal and illegal cannabis products has more than doubled in the last few decades. While ever more potent strains are bred, products like edibles or concentrates with more than 60% THC have become increasingly common, while the share of products with less than 15% THC has declined. Unfortunately, just about every problem weed creates gets worse at higher THC doses. At the same time, more and more people use weed. In the US, more people consumed cannabis daily than alcohol for the first time in 2022.
Wow.
In Canada, 26% of people 16 and older use it, up from 22% in 2018. It's not possible to say if legalization is the reason for this though, since studies are pretty inconsistent and vary massively between different users.
I don't know, I feel like legalization would definitely be the reason, considering a lot of people who wanted to smoke weed but didn't want to go through all the trouble of getting it illegally can now just get it legally. Legalization definitely contributes to it, at least to a certain degree.
Some consumption went up, in others it stayed stable, and the trend to use more weed began in the early 90s and sped up in the 2000s, way earlier than legalization. So today, more people consume more weed than ever before in the last century, and it's the strongest it's ever been. What are we seeing as a result of this? Let's start with something that used to get you laughed out of the room: addiction. Weed addiction and withdrawal symptoms. A big narrative about weed is that it's not addictive, or at least not that big of a deal.
Who says that? What idiot says that weed is not addictive? It's a drug like anything else. Who was spinning that narrative? Because I've never heard that before. I have never heard anybody say that weed is not addictive. What dumbass started spreading that nonsense?
For most people, this is true. Studies clearly show that the majority handle it well. For 8 out of 10 using weed, it's just a casual high and not problematic at all. About 2 in 10 users develop a cannabis use disorder, or CUD. CUD has 11 different symptoms, from the inability to stop when you've had enough, to using it when you know it will have negative consequences.
Given how weed is getting stronger, there's probably going to be a higher percentage of people who get addicted to it.
Be reduced to you're doing it too often, even if it's bad for you, and it's less fun than it could be. There are 3 major risk factors here: the amount of THC, how often you consume, and your age when you start using cannabis. The more THC,
I'm guessing the younger the
more
worse.
often, and the younger you are when you start, the higher your risk. If you smoke too much weed too often, it will have negative impacts on your life. So if this is you,
just like any other drug,
will make a big difference. 1 in 10 users develops a serious addiction. They usually consume daily, and their life is significantly impaired or held back because they spend a lot of their time.
What percentage of alcoholics develop an addiction? Is it worse than weed or better? I couldn't really find any stats for like worldwide, but from the little I just searched up, apparently about 10% of people who drink alcohol are alcoholics, at least in the US, which is basically the same as the drugs, well, the weed. So, seems just as bad so far.
I'm either using or recovering from cannabis use. Since their brain is building a tolerance, they need increasingly high doses or stronger weed, often both.
So just like every other drug, you need more, stronger stuff.
Users can experience bad moods, feel irritable, restless, paranoid, anxious, and even depressive.
So just like every other drug, once again.
For many addicts, it feels like they need weed to fight these symptoms. Maybe it did actually help at first, while in reality, it makes those symptoms stronger and more persistent. Studies also found that loneliness and frequent cannabis use go hand in hand. If you feel lonely, you're more likely to use weed, and if you use weed, you may experience more loneliness. It's not always easy to say which came first,
Great combination.
but they seem to reinforce each other. So on the one hand, cannabis makes loneliness feel much less bad. On the other hand, it can also make you feel more socially awkward than you actually are and withdraw from friends.
See, I don't get that. Like, if you're smoking weed together in a group of people, I can understand that, but smoking alone? That's just kind of sad, you know? It's like drinking alcohol. If you're drinking together with a group of people and you're just having fun, then yeah, I get that. That's cool. But if you're just sitting home alone and drinking, that's really just sad. Same thing with the weed.
This can lead to a downward spiral that ends in self-isolation and chronic loneliness. Another thing many people who consume a lot experience is a mental numbness that makes boredom feel okay because it impacts the reward system of your brain. Not great, but good enough. You can spend your days killing time binging mildly interesting stuff, being numb rather than having fun. Boredom is a signal to your mind to get creative or learn something new, but this is suppressed. This also makes quitting so much harder because your daily routines suddenly seem boring and unexciting.
Yeah, you just need the weed.
To go back. If you find yourself using constantly, this can also stunt your development as a person. The numbness dulls bad feelings, making it easy not to deal with them. But in life, you can only get over bad feelings if you actually feel them, and you have to process them to grow.
Nah, screw that, just do drugs. It's a far better way to deal with your problems.
The worse they'll be for you, especially if you use daily. Withdrawal can cause headaches, sweating or chills, decreased appetite, in severe cases even fever, nausea and abdominal pain. You might have trouble falling asleep, and
those are pretty normal withdrawal syndromes.
Disturbing and vivid dreams. The withdrawal can put you in a depressive mood where life feels daft and pointless. You can feel restless, angry, anxious, or nervous. You may feel unable.
I mean, so far, none of this stuff has been surprising in the slightest. It's just like any other addiction. Same symptoms, same causes, everything is basically the same. Just the drug is different. It's weed instead of alcohol or cigarettes or any other drug.
To do anything at all. After a few days, these symptoms will begin to subside, and after a few weeks, they'll be gone entirely. The exact time depends on how much and how long you've been consuming cannabis. Now,
and it's only going to get worse because it's just getting stronger and stronger.
Weed may damage your brain.
So people will depend on it more and more.
Not fun to research.
Great!
Because there's fierce debate among researchers how bad weed is for your brain and whether it has irreversible long-term consequences or not. There's no consensus yet, and it's hard to say anything definitive.
Not enough time, huh?
Having said that, THC directly interferes with critical brain chemistry. there is
I mean, so far, pretty much everything else has been the same as it is with most drugs. So I would assume that the changes to your brain will also be somewhat similar to most other drugs. In other words, they're only negative, not positive.
some evidence that it
But
may
hey,
alter its structure.
maybe I'm
If it
wrong.
does, this may go away again if you quit after a few years, or not. We don't know yet. The consequences vary a lot between individuals, but especially for heavy users, they have a variety of potentially unfunny downsides. The most common one is that your memory gets significantly worse. Sustained heavy use may reduce your ability to learn, your reasoning, perception, attention span, decision-making, language abilities, and impulse control. Most negative effects seem to go away or at least weaken over time after you quit, but again, we simply don't know enough and need more research. Where the evidence is much clearer is that consuming a lot of weed is really bad for teenagers on multiple levels. If you start using heavily early, you have many more years to build up potentially negative side effects. Teens who
So it's
use a
just
lot
about
are much more likely
doing
to
it
become addicted
for a longer
to
period
weed.
of time.
This may just be correlation and weed may not be the underlying cause, but heavy weed users are more likely to perform poorly in school and less likely to finish their education. They are, on average, less satisfied.
I mean, I'm pretty sure anyone who starts drinking at a young age will have the same effect. They're just going to do worse at school. Well, maybe just not necessarily drinking, but any other drug as well.
With their life and what they've achieved. This may simply be because if your memory and motivation are stunted, you have fewer interesting experiences and forget the ones you do have. And there is strong evidence that teen users are way more likely to develop mental health issues like psychosis, schizophrenia, depression, or anxiety later in life.
Wow,
Once
that's
again, the
great.
younger you start, the higher the risk. And it also seems to rise massively with high THC doses, making highly potent cannabis products even more dangerous for teens.
And they're only
Okay,
getting
let's
even
wrap
more
this up.
potent.
We've only focused on the negative sides in this video. That was the whole point. As we said before, for most people,
What's
weed
positive
moderation
about
is
this?
totally fine and definitely way less harmful than alcohol. You do you, we're not your parents. The upside of moderation is also that when you do it, your experience will be more intense and special. But for teens, weed, especially using it regularly or a lot of it, is a bad idea, with potentially life-changing consequences. We know that criminalization did nothing to make this better. We now have a new chance under legalization. It begins with being open and honest about the state of science and acknowledging that weed is one drug among many others.
I mean, what does it matter if you're open about it? Just look at how many people are just ruining their lives because of alcohol. Just because you make weed legal is not going to change the fact that it might ruin people's lives. People abuse alcohol, people will also abuse weed. Like, in my opinion, the negatives outweigh the positives.
Certainly not the worst one by a long shot, but also problematic for at least 1 to 3 out of 10 people using it. If you really have to try cannabis, there is a time and place, and that's in your 20s. If you're younger, the science is clear, don't do it.
Or maybe
At
just
least
don't
not
do
yet.
it.
You'll have plenty of time to experiment.
What do you even
later.
get from it? Like, what's the point of doing
Let's
cannabis?
do a different experiment now.
What does smoking weed even do for you? What does it give you, like a quick high for like maybe an hour or two, and then you're back to reality? Like, what's the point? I just don't see a point in smoking weed or doing any other drug. But at the same time, I just don't care if people do. Why should I? So if someone wants to smoke weed, do anything like that, I say let them. If they have negative consequences because of it, it's their own fault. If they don't have any negative consequences, then obviously they can control themselves and it's perfectly fine for them to do it. At least, maybe, since we don't know about the long-term effects of weed yet, or at least they can't be confirmed. I would say that since we don't know just how bad the effects can really be long-term, I would say to just not do it at all, because why take that risk? Especially if the amount of THC is just getting higher, so the weed is just getting stronger and stronger. Feels way too risky in my opinion. If you're gonna smoke weed, just do the weak stuff. You know, the like less than 15%. Because if a couple years down the line it turns out that the 60% stuff is really bad for you while the 15% is okay, you can be happy that you never did the 60%. I myself will never do drugs because I don't need them. I have other sources of happiness than drugs, and that's why I'm just never gonna do it. If I've offended anyone who does do drugs and is watching this video, then sorry. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed me ranting about how I still think drugs are bad, weed as well. If you enjoyed, consider subscribing, leaving a like. If you're interested, why not watch this video right here? And with that, I hope I'll see you in the next video.